I'm Felina.
And I'm Summer.
And you are listening to Broken Broken.
Because we're both.
The podcast about living your best life by getting real.
Hey, broken people.
Hello. Welcome back.
So what do we want to talk about today, Felina?
Well, before we have our guest on, I was just going to kind of follow up on our guest from last week. He was talking about discovering he was adopted as a 42-year-old adult, and just shared with us his story and finding his birth family and all of that. And it just got me thinking about a project I plan to start, but I haven't really done anything on it yet. Mm-hmm. But my dad is an immigrant from Mexico, and he came here in the 70s with 3 of his brothers. I know he had at least 5 or 6 sisters that stayed in Mexico. I went to Guadalajara to see my abuelita and abuelito whenever I was little. I only met my grandfather once. He died when I was in 6th grade, when I was 12, I think. And then my grandmother died when I was a freshman in college. But I have so much family in Mexico. And unlike a lot of Hispanic or Mexican people who get to grow up with, their extended family, their tias and tios live with them and all their cousins. And I didn't have that experience. And I feel like there's just this big part of my culture and my upbringing that I missed out on, and I'm really curious. And my dad and his brothers all have different stories of how they immigrated into the U.S. None of it was legal. My dad is a citizen now, but they have these crazy stories. I mean, my dad has told me one of my uncles was shot 14 times and has Mexican ballad that's semi-famous written about him. And their farm was being taken away being threatened by gangsters at the time. And when my dad and his brothers immigrated here, they all worked and sent money back home to help take care of the family and their sisters and their mom and dad. And the handful of times I got to go to Mexico, I was really young. I don't speak Spanish, unfortunately. So there's a lot of barriers for me to being able to reach out to family there, but because of Facebook, and I have one cousin who kind of speaks English, and he stays in touch with my dad and me, and so I want to start somewhere. And I have all these wonderful, really cool looking family photos from my dad's family that I don't know who the people are in them. I know, oh, that's my grandmother, that's my grandfather, but I don't know, my aunts, their names, any of that. And I'm sure that there's going to be some information on like Ancestry.com or some places like that, but I haven't even started yet. But one of my uncles, he's in his 80s. He's really ill. I don't think he's going to live all that much longer. And there's just this big, huge missing piece. And I have an undergrad degree in journalism, and my dad has always been like, when are you going to write our story? And I'm like, well, you all have different versions of the story. I don't know. But that's kind of part of the...
My mom's family's that way. None of the stories match up.
Yeah.
Like, are any of these true? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I have no clue. But I want to start somewhere, and I want to go to Mexico. I know I have family that lives in Guadalajara, which is just 3 hours away from my favorite place in Mexico, which is Puerto Vallarta. And, I've spent some time in Mexico, and, like, when I've gone, like, to Puerto Vallarta, I'll go and I play music. I play the guitar. I bought a guitar off a street musician the last time I went, and ended up getting drunk at a tequila distillery and playing guitar. Like you do. And playing guitar and singing songs with this man named Juan, and he was just like, we felt like kindred spirits. And they talked to me a lot about how like musicians are held in a higher regard in Mexico, especially than they are in the United States. Yeah, I mean, you're an artist, and that really means something there. And I don't know, like I mean, it's not like anybody in my family is a musician. I'm like, I wonder if I have, I wonder if on my dad's side, maybe there is some musicians. I don't know anything about them. I know my grandfather was more Spaniard, and my grandmother was more Aztec Indian. And so my dad was essentially a mestizo. But I don't know anything else. I don't really know where they came from. I don't know anything beyond them. Right. So I'm just really curious, and I'm going to start researching. So when my dad came to visit last weekend, and I pulled out some old pictures, and he labeled the names of people for me, so that I could kind of have a place to start. Yeah. And there's going to be a language barrier, but, fortunately, the rest of the world isn't so arrogant to think that their language is the only one they should know. So, I think a lot of my extended family, like cousins and second cousins, will, I know there are some college educated, cousins in my family in Mexico that speak English. So I'm hoping I can find someone and start reaching out and find someone who's as interested in this as I am, and maybe wants to let me come visit, and I want to document all this. And
that'd be amazing.
Yeah, so I'm just now, I'm feeling drawn to do this, I think just because I'm getting a little older, and my daughter wants to know more about her history. And, we don't have a lot of family. We have my dad, and that's it. My mom passed away, and, Sophia's dad's family is pretty small as well, and we always have this, I don't know, I just have this urge, this ache for family and wanting to know where I come from. So, I don't know, just after our conversation with Jeff from last week and his search for his family, it made me think about this thing that I've been wanting to do.
I like it.
Yeah, and so I'm thinking, well, if I say it right now and we put it out there, then I have to do it.
Right.
I have to do it. I need to stop.
Be accountable to your own
Yeah, I need to stop not prioritizing it and make it more of a priority to spend an hour here and there just to do a little research and get started, because I want to learn more about where I come from. So that's my project.
And the DNA testing is really changing that for a lot of people too. I know I have a friend who, I guess late last year, all she had of her information on her father was his name and the region of Mexico that he came from. Searched for years, I don't remember what his name was, but it was a super common name.
Right, like Smith, but Mexican, yeah.
Right, I think his name was probably Juan or something, where there's millions of people with
Juan
that name.
Lopez,
yes. And so she finally broke down and did one of the DNA kits,
and it was helpful,
and because there were cousins who had taken them and put themselves on the registry too, so it will match you up. Right, not the ones that try to tell you what your ancestry is; those aren't very reliable. But the ones that do the registry, where you can see who's related to you, and so then she connected with them and being able to find out more about her family.
Well, we need to find out which one she used. And then maybe they'll want to sponsor my journey.
Right? That would be amazing.
Yeah, because I do want to document it all and see what comes of it.
You got to get those videography skills going so you can record
I
everything.
need a GoPro.
I
think that's probably what needs to happen.
I think that'd be a good idea.
Anyway.
We should start a GoFundMe for your camera.
Yes!
All right. So today we're going to be talking to Celia Williamson. She's been working on the issue of human trafficking for the last 25 years as an advocate, researcher, and teacher. She's also engaged in street outreach, case management, lobbying for changes in laws. She's the director of the Human Trafficking and Social Justice Institute at the University of Toledo. And let's see if we can get Celia on the line here. Celia?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Summer Wesley.
Yeah.
How are you?
Good.
Thank you for being willing to do this.
Oh, sure.
I have my co-host here, Felina.
Hi, Celia. It's nice to meet you.
Hi.
So can you kind of tell us a little bit about what you do? Your email signature line said you're the director of the institute?
Yeah. So I direct the Human Trafficking and Social Justice Institute at the University of Toledo. And I've been involved in anti-trafficking work for 25 years. So I've done probably since 1993, and I've done all kinds of work, from street outreach to case management, going in jails, going in crack houses, and to policy work. We passed 3 state laws, to forming a coalition, running a state, not running, but a member of a state anti-trafficking coalition, I started the oldest human trafficking conference in the nation. It's 15 years old now. We have about 1,500 people that attend.
And what is that called?
Say that again.
And what is that called?
It's the Human Trafficking and Social Justice Conference.
Okay.
I am a professor at the University of Toledo. So I have a PhD. I do research. I've been funded by um, the Department of Justice and National Institutes of Health for like 10 straight years
Okay.
to do research in this area. So, yeah.
Okay, I feel like we're hearing the phrase human trafficking a lot lately, but I feel like maybe the general public doesn't really understand what it is. So, what is the first thing you think that we should know as the public about it?
Yeah, I think what we should know is really human trafficking is made up of two types of trafficking: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So, in the U.S., and it's a global phenomenon, but in the U.S., we have a federal law. It's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that passed in 2000. And it basically says that anybody that's involved in a commercial sex trade, of any kind of commercial sex trade, and they're there because of force, fraud, or coercion, then they're a victim of sex trafficking. Or if they're involved in labor, some type of job, where they're there because of force, fraud, or coercion, then they're a victim of labor trafficking. Or if they have not reached the age of 18. So if they're under 18 and they're involved in the commercial sex trade, under federal law, they're automatically a victim of the crime of sex trafficking. And they are a child in need of care instead of a juvenile delinquent.
Oh, okay. So that protects them in that way.
Yes.
Is there any delineated definition as far as the force or coercion?
Yeah, there's, lawyers battle that in court in terms of definitions. And there are certain definitions, but, the law kind of stays a little bit vague so that you can argue those things. But there's definite definitions about coercion, about force, about fraud, and those types of things. But those are largely for adults, and anybody who's under the age of 18 then would automatically be a victim. And so it's been a process of, even though the federal law has been passed, it's been a process of getting state laws, advocates in each state, getting their state to pass laws so that people can prosecute traffickers on a state level. So in my community, though, we have a federal task force here because of the problem we have here. So we can prosecute people using the state law, or prosecutors can use the federal law.
And where do you live?
I'm in Toledo, Ohio.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you know how many states do and don't have those laws? Any idea?
I don't.
Okay.
All I can say is that Shared Hope International, which is a website, and PolarisProject.org grades states. So it's very clear, anybody can go on those websites and they can look, and your state will get, if it's Polaris Project, if they give your state a green color, then they're doing, a lot to fight human trafficking. Or if you go to Shared Hope website, you get a grade from A to F on how well your state is doing in terms of fighting trafficking, in terms of passing laws and those types of things.
Interesting. What was that website again?
It's Shared Hope International.
Okay.
And yeah, they talk a lot about domestic trafficking. So we're talking about human trafficking. We're really talking about people that are brought here from other countries to be in the commercial sex or the labor trade. But we also have an estimate about 100,000 American teens that are trapped as sex trafficking victims. And that's according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
Wow. And so tell me a little bit more about the work that you do.
So the work that I do, when I started in 1993, I would drive to work, and I was really interested in working with kids and families at a community center in a high crime area. And I was passing these women on the street, and I really didn't like them. I wanted to work with kids and families, and I wanted them to go away. And then one day I thought about, what services are they getting, or you know, I'm supposed to be focused on making communities better. And what was I doing? So I started to build a relationship with the women on the street and try to wave and try to slow my car and try to talk and try, slowly build a relationship until I ended up spending 6 months on the street 3 times a week, all day, interviewing women, hanging out, learning the culture of the streets, learning about trafficking, where the trap houses were, who the pimps or the traffickers were, and those types of things. And then after 6 months, I built one of the first programs, the first program in Ohio that was an anti-trafficking program that's still open today that works with victims.
And how old were the ladies that you were seeing?
They were adults, and in their late 20s, 30s, early 40s. And then when I would ask them when they got started and how they got started, most had been, gotten into prostitution when they were 13, 14, 15 years old. And so as many women change and grow through relationship, I heard devastating stories about these women's lives and what happened to them when they were kids, and I couldn't believe that no one was doing anything about it. There wasn't a program. No one was really sympathetic to what was going on in their lives. They were clearly victims of abuse. And so just started to work on, at the end of 6 months, I just asked them, what kind of program would you have that would help people like you in this situation? What components would you have in the program? And we sat down and we wrote it all out. And then I just started to advocate, and I developed that program, and that program is still going on. And then I just really found out that one program wasn't enough, because there were child protection would end up giving the baby to the trafficker, because they would understand that the woman was a prostitute and she was not any good, doing bad things with her life, and they'd understand that he was the trafficker, or the judge was sentencing her to jail time and her customer was walking away, or people thought that she chose to just go out on the street and become drug addicted and sell her body, and they didn't understand that she was trafficked as a young person, a 13 or 14-year-old, and raped, beaten, sold, abused, and then used drugs to cope with complex and chronic trauma. And then after all that happened to her, the trafficker would walk away from her and leave her in that situation, and she'd end up back on the streets of Toledo, drug addicted, and nobody really had sympathy for her. So I was trying to, at that time, write grants and win grants from the Violence Against Women money, and I couldn't win grants when my competition was women who were victims of domestic violence, and they're trying to just live a great life and somebody's beating them up, and my women seemingly are out on the streets addicted to drugs. Who cares? They took themselves out there. So I couldn't really compete. And so it finally dawned on me that I needed to work on changing the paradigm. I needed to change the perspective of the people in my community. And so, I worked a lot with the media. I promised to give them a story every month, statistics, a personal story about a woman's life, and they would get readers, and I would get readers who would change their perspective about these women and these kids.
That's great.
Yeah, so that's what happened.
And so how has your career grown since then? What do you do now, or what was your path to what you're doing now?
Well, now I run a conference. It's been going on 15 years. Like I said, we have about 1,500 people that come. We have about 90 presenters from across the country and around the world. It happens every year in September in Toledo. And so I do that. I do a lot of research, because if you want people to create change or pass laws, then you have to produce the research, the facts, the credibility. And so I'll do a lot of that. We just finished developing a 10-topic curriculum for youth that are at risk so we can do some prevention. We coordinate the city's services here so that we have a well-coordinated service team that helps move victims to survivors and survivors to thrivers so that our victims can recover. Most all of them have chronic long-term trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, some have traumatic brain injury, those things. And so we collaborate a lot across cities and across the country. We have a global association of human trafficking scholars that we meet and talk about what's going on globally. So yeah, it's amazing. And all I was really, really going to do was just go on the streets, learn what women need, and then provide it. That was it.
Well, I would say that you're doing that. I mean,
yeah.
It's just a much bigger mountain than you expected to climb.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I didn't know until much later in my life that I had 3 friends from my neighborhood, my very block of my neighborhood, that were trafficked.
Wow.
And I didn't know that when I was a kid that these 3 girls got involved in prostitution, and one escaped and moved to Kansas. The other got drug addicted and battled that for several years, and the third one was murdered by one of her customers. And then me, who went to college. How did that happen? So yeah.
Can you tell us your story, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I don't really have it. I mean, I grew up poor in an urban area in Toledo where there was a lot of crime, but I had 2 parents. I had, and I don't believe you need 2 parents. I believe you need one consistently pro-social, loving person in your life. But
Right.
I was lucky to have 2. My father worked, my mother stayed home, took care of kids, cooked, graduated high school, went to college. It was very strange because I was in a neighborhood of chaos. But that's why I know if you're in a low income, high crime area, it depends on how many protective factors you have in your life and how many risk factors. I had a lot of protective factors, and some of my friends who were great, wonderful people, but they had a lot of risk factors and not a lot of protective factors. They might have had parents that were alcoholics, or parents that were just poor, good people, but were poor. And so they were faced a lot of risk. And, and then there's, of course, some blessing, I guess, in there too. So my story isn't interesting or exciting. I went to school, and that was my safe haven. Just keep going to school until I got a PhD, because that's the only thing I knew. That, I didn't know what was on the other side of life. I just knew I didn't want this.
Right.
Right.
So,
and you knew an education would help keep you from that.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's the lesson I'm trying to teach my daughter too. So.
Exactly.
Yes, that's how I
am. I mean, I hung out with all of the, risky people. I experimented with the alcohol, the drugs. I hung out late at night. I did all those things. But somehow deep in myself, I knew I was just kind of playing with these things. I was just kind of experimenting with these things. So I knew I didn't want that for my life, and I knew it wasn't going to be for my life. But, I had no idea. I thought I live in North Toledo. I'll help people in North Toledo. I'll retire to North Toledo. And that's what I thought was going to happen. But it just kept rolling into bigger,
much bigger
things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any thoughts on SESTA and FOSTA?
Yeah, that's where there's a back page, online back page, where you can buy things. And so some of the things that they were doing was selling kids into trafficking and commercial sex. And so Senator Portman and some other people went after Backpage and to get that shut down. So, it's very controversial, because some people say, well, they wanted it shut down because we can't know that people are selling kids on the internet and let it happen. And some people say, no, we shouldn't have shut it down, because what happened was now the police don't know as much where to look. They can't police it as well.
Right.
And then there's a whole sex worker argument.
Right.
And so the sex worker argument I'll address first is we have a conference where we talk about trafficking and we talk about survivors of trafficking, and we also have sex workers that come and talk about sex work, and that's their job. And their oppression is that people keep trying to rescue them from something they don't want to be rescued from.
Right.
I don't tell women what their reality is. So if they tell me that they choose sex work and they're an empowered woman, I'm not going to tell them that they are victimized and exploited and they just don't know it yet. I don't do that because the first rule of feminism is to believe the multiple realities of women. So I have to do that. And the ones who tell me they were victimized by that, I have to do my best to try to help them escape that and become a thriver. So when I think about the Backpage controversy, I'm a supporter of the fact that it was shut down.
Okay.
And the reason that I support that is because, one, I don't think as a country we should stand for kids being sold online and we know about it and we're okay about it. So I don't like that idea. I do like the idea. I love the free speech idea. So I'm a little nervous about that. I wasn't comfortable with it, but because I love the free speech idea. I've used free speech years ago when nobody was trying to listen to me about these kids being trafficked. I don't buy the argument of, oh my God, we won't know where to police it now. Well, we don't treat robbery that way. We don't say, hey, well, let's leave the bank open. Let's leave one bank open downtown so that when all the robbers come there to rob it, we can catch them. That's just not how we police things. So I'm not, if the cops don't know where to patrol it or how to investigate it, then they need to get smarter on how to investigate it. We don't need to leave this open so kids could be sold on there so you know where to find them. That I don't support. So the only thing I'm uncomfortable with is the freedom of speech. That I'm a little...
So as far as you're concerned, removing that has reduced the numbers, you think, of trafficking the children, or just pushed it somewhere else?
I don't think it's reduce the number. I don't think shutting down Backpage has reduced the number of kids being sold. I think traffickers find other ways. For instance, in my community, one of the ways that people traffic kids is to text. They'll use these houses. They'll go to a friend or whoever, and they'll say, hey, let me use your house for the weekend. I'll give you $500, and your house will be exactly the way you left it. Just don't ask any questions. The person leaves. They text all the potential customers. They have their girls at that house or boys, and then all the customers come to that house. And so it's a moving target. It always moves, and so it's harder to police and it's harder to investigate. That's what happens in my community, and in communities across the country. There's still a lot of people being sold at truck stops. It's basically wherever supply is taken to demand. So wherever you see customers, men with money in their pockets, casinos, sporting events, conventions, truck stops, that's where supply is going to be taken to demand.
So can we talk about the demand? Who's the typical customer, shall we say?
Customers come in all shapes, sizes, and ages. White, black, Asian, it's a customer. I would say I can tell you who, like, the women would want as a customer. I mean, if you're a trafficking victim, or if you're a woman in prostitution, or if you're a sex worker, and I distinguish between the three. So, a trafficking victim is there because of force, fraud, or coercion, or they're a kid. They have no business being there. They don't want to be there. And then there's women in prostitution, or what we call prostituted women, and they're there because they're in poverty, because they're drug addicted, because they're trying to survive. So that's a different category. And then there are women there because they're sex workers. They've chosen this as a profession, and this is largely, in America anyway, sex workers are largely white middle class women and up. You're not going to really see poor women of color with this argument.
Okay.
Still valid, but you're not going to see a whole lot of poor women with this debate or this argument. But now, I was going to answer the question. So the women would say that the customer that they would prefer, if they had to have one or wanted to have one, would be a older white man. And that is because, he is more likely, they would say, to be compliant. He's more likely to tip. It's
Mm-hmm.
what you're doing when you're engaging someone is you're trying to figure out, are you interested in a sex for money exchange?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you interested in hurting me, robbing me,
Right.
something like that? And so those are some of the kind of their protective factors.
Mm-hmm.
As if they had a choice, I think that's the person that they would choose.
I think the reason I was asking is I think I see really commonly when these stories come out about trafficking rings or whatever, the commentary from a lot of the public is they seem to think about the customers as, monsters hiding in a dark corner, and don't realize these are your fathers, your neighbors, your pastor maybe. These are people you are around all of the time. And without that demand, there would not be this supply.
That's exactly accurate. And the guy that's buying kids or what, this guy isn't living under the bridge, okay?
Right.
He's not the creep under the bridge, because the creep under the bridge can't afford, when you're talking a 14 or 15, you're talking a gold standard premium product, that's expensive. So we're talking about people that are in jobs that, we did a study across 5 Ohio cities where we asked women, who bought you?
Mm-hmm.
Who paid for your services? And we largely found out, lawyers, police officers, city employees, social workers, pastors. It was men.
Mm-hmm.
Professionals.
Yeah,
Right.
It was just men with pretty good jobs. And a matter of fact, in October, we have 2 pastors that are going on trial for trafficking in our community.
Wow.
So, it's not the creepy guy under the bridge. I mean, a couple months ago, we had a vice cop on trial for trafficking.
Well, they would know exactly where to look, wouldn't they?
Who was it?
A vice cop.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
I mean, he was found not guilty, but
Oh, of course he was.
yeah, of course. Of course. So these 2 pastors are going to be on trial in this month, October.
So what measures have been taken that have reduced trafficking? So now you said that you agreed with SESTA and FOSTA, but they didn't really seem to have reduced child trafficking. Right. So what measures have you seen work to reduce?
Well, I think it's a combination of, we passed a few laws. One of the most important laws that many states have passed is called Safe Harbor. And Safe Harbor law says that child trafficking is child abuse, basically. So it really shifted the paradigm from saying, these are juvenile delinquents, they need to be seen in court, to, these are children in need of care, they need to be seen by child welfare. So it really shifted the way we looked at kids, because it's hard to say to kids, would you come forward and please tell us if somebody is making you do this? And then as soon as they tell us, we put them in detention.
Right.
So how does that make sense? You haven't committed a crime. You're indeed a victim of a crime. And then we lock you up. And so we've done that for a number of years. And so now we're stopping that practice, not convicting or adjudicating kids who are victims of this crime. Another law that Ohio has passed is if you committed crimes while you were under the force and coercion of someone else, your lawyer can go in and argue that and expunge those records so that you can now start getting training and a livable wage job. So we're starting to remove those barriers that keep women subjugated,
So,
even when they're free.
so would that also, those collateral crimes that they might have committed while being trafficked, does that affect the prosecution of those as well, that they aren't being prosecuted as often?
Yeah, if we can catch it
Uh-huh.
now and
Right.
say, oh, okay, Your Honor, she was a trafficking victim, we can prove that she's been a trafficking victim and she was forced to do this, to do that. Sometimes though, because we are just recently passing these laws, we have to go retroactive.
Okay.
So somebody that has been, convicted of burglary or whatever, we can go back into court and say, okay, in 2016, this person was a trafficking victim, and we already went through court and established that, and her trafficker is in prison now. During that time, she was forced to do this. Your Honor, this is holding her back from getting a livable wage job, from moving on with her life. And so we're able to then clean up some of her record so that she is able to start a new life.
So it helps with expungements. Does it help with, like, say, early release or anything of that nature if they're currently serving sentences?
It could, but you would have to have a pretty good lawyer. And people are training lawyers. What's happening with the whole paradigm shift is, social workers are being trained to work with victims, to offer trauma treatment, to do all these things that we know are good practice. Criminal justice are being trained. For instance, every police officer in Ohio is already trained. So they're trained to identify victims. There are task forces all across the country that know a lot about trafficking, so that when Joe Cop finds an indicator or whatever, all he does is call the task force, because the task force can investigate and they can remove the entire cell, the entire organization, whereas the Joe Cop will bust in the door and arrest one link in the chain.
Okay.
They can take out the entire cell. So as criminal justice is making a shift to learn about trafficking, to not interrogate victims but interview victims.
Okay.
So criminal justice is making a shift. Social workers are making a shift in how they treat victims and receive victims. Healthcare is making a change, because we know 88% of our victims in the U.S. have been to an emergency room or a clinic. And so that's a window of opportunity. So we're training our healthcare system to identify victims. For instance, in my community, Northwest Ohio, every one of our hospital presidents in our 24 facilities have agreed to have their ER staff and their clinic staff trained in identifying and reporting trafficking.
These are all great things that are happening to help people who have already been victimized.
Yes.
But as far as my question earlier, in saying that SESTA and FOSTA didn't really help as a deterrent for,
Yes.
The initial trafficking of children, has there been anything that you've found that is a deterrent from them, preventing the
Prevention?
victimization? Yes.
Yeah, so there's a couple of prevention programs going, not a couple, there's a whole lot of prevention programs cropping up in schools and all across the U.S. for young people that are at risk. Our curriculum is particularly for young people at risk. So our curriculum isn't designed to just go in a school and educate the general population. We're really looking for those kids that are at high risk, and we know who they are because we've done the research to identify kids that are at risk. So we're doing that part. In terms of law enforcement and being a deterrent for potential traffickers, that really isn't happening, I don't think, but I'm a little bit jaded, but I don't think we're creating such a huge deterrent yet across the U.S. Because I don't think that if you get 30 years in prison, and we've had some traffickers get 30 years in prison from my community, I just don't think that traffickers connect the potential time they could get in prison by what they're looking at. I think they think they're smarter.
Right.
I think they think they're not going to get caught. I don't think that's a deterrent.
Right.
I think that when, the U.S. has a national campaign called Rescue and Restore, and that's our national human trafficking campaign. They ask professionals and general community to rescue criminal justice, to rescue the community, to restore. I think it's a deeper issue, and it has to do with human rights. It's deeper than that, and it has to do with a deep-rooted sense of sexism and entitlement.
Absolutely.
Not only in the U.S. but around the world. And until we change our perspective about how we can treat women,
well, until they're not seen as possessions,
right,
or property anymore. Yeah, which I guess, I mean, that's the thing with Cesta and FOSTA for me, is that, you know, it's placing all this responsibility on the victims. You know, it's taking away, you know, well, all of these things that we're really talking about is like, you know, we're going to teach these kids, you know, preventative measures and go to the at-risk kids. But what are we doing to deter the men who are actually perpetuating these heinous crimes from doing this? You know, what are we doing to fix that problem? It's the same issue with, you know, women, violence against women. You know, it's all about the women. Well, don't dress provocatively. Don't do this. Don't do that. Well, what are you doing to teach men to be decent human beings? And
I can tell you that that was the law. So we passed a law in 2010. We passed the Safe Harbor law in 2012. 2014, we were able to pass our what we call demand legislation, meaning if you purchase somebody who's a victim or a kid who's a victim, you're going to be facing a felony. Okay, there's a reason it took until 2014 to pass demand legislation.
That's insanity. Was it a felony before 2014 to purchase a child? Wow. Sorry. I'm shocked.
Right. No, not necessarily. Not if you put money in somebody's hand or in that kid's hand. Not necessarily. So it was the hardest one to pass.
Wow.
Because you're talking about, now we're coming, and not me, I mean the whole community and the legislator that's leading this cause, coming after people who are very entitled, who are very powerful, and who want access to vulnerable kids.
Well, you've seen how men who are entitled to things behave and when they're questioned. So we've all seen that lately.
Yes. So that's our issue. And so when we have a population that's seen by a lot of men as a almost a expendable throwaway kind of population, and even from the research lens, you know, it's hard to put your research lens on people with power and study it. It's easy to go out on the street or to go in juvenile detention and talk to kids and write about kids and interview women on drugs and, you know, women that were trafficked. That's easy. When you try to go in and talk to men about their behavior and about them being a customer and about, they have so many protections. You can't get through those barriers to study it, to talk about it, to have conversations about it, to pass laws about it.
Right. Yeah, well, I guess that makes a lot of sense. I mean, how can you research their behavior if they're guarded and don't admit it? No, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, there's a study done about trafficking law, and it said that the more female legislators you have in a state, the more likely you are to pass comprehensive anti-trafficking laws. The more men you have in a state, the less likely you are to pass comprehensive human trafficking laws.
This makes me never want to vote for another man in office ever.
Yeah.
And it's like when you look, you know, when you see like the movie Taken, this is my pet peeve on the movie Taken. You have, you know, it's about human trafficking and Liam Neeson, and his daughter is trafficked and he goes to another country to rescue her. And it's the American story. It's the American story we love to tell. First, you know, white guy saves the day. That's the American story.
White savior complex is real.
Yeah, and so when you look at the study, though, the more female legislators, the more likely to have comprehensive law. So it's really women saving the day. But in the movie, he saves the day. He goes to another country. He wreaks havoc, but he's an American, so he can do that, and he doesn't go to jail or anything.
And this stuff just doesn't happen here, right?
Right. And so, America, Germany, some of the first world countries are notorious for being one of the highest rated sex buyers in the world. So actually, she's safer to leave the U.S. and go to another country, provided it's not Germany. But because U.S. and Germany kind of rival for number one. So, but she gets trafficked. Why? When she's out of the country, and by who? The Arabs, because that's another
xenophobia
story.
Right. Yeah.
And none of that is reality. And then at the end, she goes on to have her singing or acting career, I forget, but no trauma.
Right, yeah.
Right. We'll pretend that doesn't exist. Yeah.
Right. And so you just finish your popcorn and you believe that's the way the world works.
Yeah. I'm upset right now. I'm sorry. I don't even have anything to say.
Very emotional.
So I'm really irritated right now.
Yes. Yes.
I guess this is probably how you feel on a daily basis. And it's not that I don't think, that I didn't care before this moment, but, I think it's something that people don't want to think about every day because it is so hard and heavy to deal with,
And you see it from, like you said, you see it from the top down to the lowest rung to the highest rung. And this is the time in our society, with the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement, and, this is the time. Like, if we are going to really give women a voice in this country and vulnerable people a voice around the world, this is the time to do it.
Well, this is telling me, I had a boyfriend who's no longer a boyfriend tell me once that he thought the Me Too movement had gone too far. That was one trigger to one reason why I was like, yeah, you're not for me.
Right.
And hearing stuff like this, like, it just makes me want to scream it even louder.
Mm-hmm.
We're not making enough noise still, and we're screaming pretty damn loud, and it's still not enough. And, we have to fight so hard as women just to be heard as an equal to men, and we still often aren't. And they wonder why we're screaming so loud. They wonder why we're still shouting.
I don't think they wonder
Me Too.
why. I think they just wonder how to shut us up.
The old methods don't work anymore, They don't have the times are changing. They can't shut us up like they used to.
Yeah.
So.
That's right. It's like, I think it's, what we were willing to put up with yesterday, we're not willing to put up with today.
Absolutely.
Right. We have a lot more options.
I feel my tolerance going down on a personal level.
Same.
I prefer to just be alone than to deal with a man who's not a hardcore feminist these days,
Yes, that's right. That's right. And I think of the women and the struggles that they have to make all the way back from, we had one survivor that, her throat was cut and she was left for dead in the alley in our community. And she fought her way all the way back to get her bachelor's degree.
Oh, good for her.
Yeah, and it's amazing and it's wonderful. But it's like, why did that even have to happen to you? Why did you have to fight and struggle and use a lot of your life's blood, a lot of your spiritual energy, your intellectual energy, your emotional, mental health, just to get this far? Just
to survive, rather than to think what she could have done if she was just focusing on thriving.
Right.
But that's exactly.
But you know what? What they don't know, what they're doing is they're just making us incredibly, incredibly strong. And we're going to be, we already are much stronger than most men because they don't have to deal with the adversity and the bullshit, the day-to-day bullshit that we have to deal with.
True.
So they don't have the strength that we have.
That's right.
So they should be threatened. They should be scared.
Right.
They should be scared. That's what I say. That's what I tell my team every day. I say every day that I wake up in the morning and my toes hit the floor, like that saying says, you better be scared. Don't blink because I got you, because I'm on my game. I hope you're on yours. That's what I say to traffickers. I'm doing everything in my power and every ounce of energy I have fighting this issue. And not me, but there's a lot of people, women and men, fighting this issue to try to just get some semblance of equity, some acknowledgement of being a human being. And so, the fight continues. But I say, as women, what else do we have to do? I mean, we've been carrying it all. So why not?
Fix the
why
world.
not?
What else do we have to do?
We need to just be a matriarchal society again.
Yes.
Well, thank you for being willing to talk to us, and thank you for all the work you do. Is there
For
anywhere
sure.
that people can keep up with the work that the Institute does? Do you have social media or anything like that?
Absolutely. I am starting a podcast myself because I want to do a human trafficking focused podcast on how to do this work, because a lot of people, when they learn about it, they get very passionate about it, and then they start searching on the internet for, okay, how do I do it?
Right.
And there's dead air. There's nothing that teaches you street outreach or case management or opening a group home for survivors or any of those things. I've done those things, so I'm going to spend the rest of my career really spending that little bit of time on a podcast teaching people how to do things. So when I start it, it's going to be called Emancipation Nation.
Okay.
Otherwise, we have a conference every year in September, and they can go to traffickingconference.com, and that's where we'll have about 90 presenters over the course of 2 days that will teach people everything from soup to nuts in terms of trafficking, human rights, and social justice.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
You have a good evening.
Okay, you too. Bye.
Okay, so follow-up comments?
I'm pissed off right now. I'm actually looking up a friend who I know does trafficking work to connect her, to connect them. So I'm pissed off and motivated right now.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear it. I did want to say, I know we have talked about the laws. I can't remember.
SESTA and FOSTA.
Thank you. I never remember the acronyms. I know we have talked about this on the podcast before, even before you came on, that I personally am of the opinion that I did not support the laws.
Ditto.
Because
as she even said,
it didn't do anything to reduce the number of trafficking of children, but it did make
voluntarily
make
sex
life
workers
much less safe for those for sex workers.
Yeah.
And so as of course, there's the free speech argument as well, but
Yeah.
really the one that resonated with me the most is how less safe things are for sex workers. And I feel like there was an empathy gap in the debate that was happening about that. I felt like how she was talking about trafficking victims have been seen as expendable. I felt like while that debate was happening, that sex workers were being treated as expendable, and it didn't matter to the decision makers that it was going to make their life more difficult and make them less safe. So that's
my 2 cents as well.
You can contact the podcast at brokebrokenpodcast@gmail.com. The Broken Podcast can be found on Twitter at Broke Broken Show, on Instagram and Facebook at Broke Broken Podcast.